It's really wonderful to be here. This must be, based on all of those programs you've been running, this must be the best educated Jewish community in the world. Like anybody who's gone to all of those hours of Jewish education must be brimming with understanding. Um, so I'm going to start at the beginning. As Ari and I were talking about before the program began, there is a lot of there are a lot of references now to transgender people, non-binary people, there are other terms that are floating around. But because we're a tiny minority, many people have very little experience of people who identify in those kinds of ways. So that's actually very much the way that I grew up. My 60th birthday is tomorrow. This makes me feel like, I don't know, like I've passed through several ages of the world already. But when I was growing up, in the world that I was growing up in, there was no such thing as transgender people. As far as I could tell, everybody was either and only male or female, except me. I knew that I was something different, and I kept trying to make sense of what that is, but everybody else seemed to fit more or less comfortably into one of those boxes. And when babies were born, I'm sure this was the case when I was born, somebody would look at the baby's genitals and say, it's a boy or it's a girl. And by that, they meant not only this child is physically this sex or that sex, but they also thought that they were saying this is a heterosexual, heteronormative child who is going to identify and live in ways that we think conform to what males and females should be, will grow up to be a heterosexual man or woman, get married, want the things that are that are appropriate. Because I was Jewish, I was going to say Kaddish for my parents, and so forth and so on. And at that time, in 1961, there wasn't a sense of the range of variation that could go along with being born into a physically male or physically female body. There have always been bodies that aren't physically male or female, what we would now call intersex, but that's not what I'm talking about. The assumption when I was born was that being male meant that you were going to live whatever the destiny of your culture had laid out for you as a male. And it took quite a long time before I was aware that there was anybody else who, like me, struggled to find a place in that system. So now we recognize this very broad category of what we call transgender and non-binary people. And transgender and non-binary is a way of saying, you know how you have those multiple choice surveys that say, do you identify, are you this, that, or other? Trans and non-binary is a way of saying other, right? It's a way of saying, you know, male and female, that's not me. I am something else. And within that range of other, there are many, many different relations to gender and identity. And they're not connected to each other. It's kind of like if you're Jewish and you meet somebody else who says that they're Jewish, you know that you don't actually know what that word means to them. You know that you have some kind of connection to them if you're a fellow Jew, but what kind of a Jew are you? What do you mean by that? Where did you grow up? Are you religious? Are you not religious? Are you a Zionist? Are you an anti-Zionist? Are you, there's all kinds of different ways of being Jewish. And it's similar with when somebody identifies themselves as transgender or non-binary. They're saying it's like in a culture that assumes everybody who's Christian, somebody who says they're Jewish, you feel like you know something about them. But if you're Jewish, you're like, yeah, well, let's have the conversation and figure out what we're really talking about here. Who are you actually? So the kind of transgender identity that I would later grow up to realize I fell into is what used to be called a transsexual. This is now an old-fashioned term, but hey, I'm an old-fashioned trans person, so this is not this is a term that makes college students scowl when I use it in talks on college campuses. But when one of the few kinds of alternatives to being male or being female that American culture has recognized is what used to be called transsexual, which is to say somebody is born into a physically female or male body, but identifies as the opposite gender, right? And so here's where things start getting complicated in ways that are profound. When I was born, I don't think the word gender had been invented yet, because people didn't have a need to distinguish between physical sex and the identity of people in physically male or female bodies. It was assumed that the two were one and the same, so why do you need a separate term? There'd always been people who we would now call trans and non-binary and intersex, but there wasn't any real recognition of them. But while I was a kid, there were psychologists who started experimenting on kids like me, or kids like me who had more courage than I did. They were kids who refused to behave like the boys and girls they were supposed to be. They kept insisting that they were the opposite, and they weren't delusional, they weren't psychotic, although some of them were institutionalized and medicated and all this kind of stuff. There were people working with them, like, these kids, they seem like they've got it together, except that they're saying this crazy stuff. And so to describe these children, they invented, they said they're physically this sex, but their gender is something different. So that was the beginning of conceptually distinguishing between sex and gender. Actually, feminists had been working on doing this without inventing the term gender. Feminists had been working on this for centuries. Anytime a woman said, yes, I'm a woman, but that doesn't mean I can't do this, or I'm not good at doing that, or whatever, like they were trying to say the sex of my body doesn't determine my gender, which is to say who I know myself to be, what my life should be, what we would call now gender expression. But because there wasn't, because they weren't saying I'm not a woman, they didn't have to invent this separate term. So while I'm busy growing up, other kids who are either braver than I am or more foolish than I was, or both, are refusing to pretend.
Just a question.
Yeah.
Can you tell us where you grew up?
Rochester, New York.
And did you grow up in a Orthodox house, an unaffiliated house, a conservative house, traditional house? What was the nature of the Jewish house that you grew up in?
So that's complicated, right? My family was not religious. My father came from the labor wing of the Eastern European diaspora, right? So his parents were labor activists in the ILGWU, and they did not consider it cool to be Jewishly religious, but they were certainly ethnically Jewish. My father expressed this during Passover. He expressed this visually. We would do seders, but he would read through the Maxwell House Haggadah, which at the best of times is unintelligible gibberish. He would read through it at top speed, and he would start the seder with his kippah at this kind of an angle on his head, 45-degree angle. It was kind of like a Hitchcock movie where you're watching and waiting for something to fall, right? So we would watch as the kippah would slip lower and lower, and the idea was to get through the Haggadah before the kippah fell off. So that was his way of saying he was Jewish, sure. My mother had a different relation. She grew up in the Montreal ghetto. Her mother's family was very Orthodox. Actually, I only recently found out that they were Hasidic family. She had a grandfather who was a rabbi who was fairly well known, but her mother had gone off the derech, as they say. She had rebelled against it and was militantly secular. So my mother grew up with a very strong ethnic Jewish identity and an extended family that was extremely religious, but her mother, who she idolized, rejected Judaism. So when my mother started having kids in upstate New York, for reasons I don't understand, she was like, I'm not going to live in the suburbs, because there was a Jewish suburb, right? Jews had been prevented from buying houses in most areas in the city that had recently opened up, but there were Jewish suburbs where you could go. All your, your kids would grow up in a Jewish neighborhood, going to schools that were closed for the Jewish holidays. My mother didn't want that for reasons I never understood. But so we lived in a non-Jewish area, and so she was concerned that her children wouldn't know who we were. We wouldn't be subjected to enough anti-Semitism, I guess, was the fear. And she was right. It wasn't a very anti-Semitic, there weren't enough Jews for people to really hate Jews. We weren't part of the cultural landscape. So this turned out to be very good training for being a trans person, by the way. I was one of a couple of Jews in my school, and that meant that nobody could ever remember that I was Jewish. They didn't remember what being Jewish meant. They thought I celebrated Christmas. They couldn't pronounce Hanukkah. They never remembered what matzah was, right? And it's the same when you're a hyper minority of any kind. There are very few trans people, so people tend to forget. They don't remember, it's complicated. So being the minority as a Jewish kid was good training for what I would later experience as a trans person. Well, so my mother wanted us to have a sense of being Jewish. And to do that, she made us join a synagogue. And she picked the weirdest synagogue in Rochester. I've never heard of another synagogue quite like this, actually. An Orthodox shul had burned down a year or two before, and most of the Orthodox congregation had formed another Orthodox shul. But a small number of elderly Eastern European immigrants who didn't speak much English didn't want to do that. Who knows why? I'm sure they wouldn't have set foot in a shul like that for reasons of their own. So they formed a new shul with young families, as my family was at that point, young families who really should have been like Reform or whatever. They were nominally Jewish, but they wanted their kids to have some kind of a Jewish education and bar and bat mitzvahs. So there was no rabbi who could satisfy both parts of this congregation. And so we went through a different rabbi every year. If a rabbi satisfied the elderly Orthodox men, the young families hated him. If the rabbi satisfied the young family, he couldn't handle the Orthodox men who would shout back during sermons and things like that. So there was only one rabbi who he was fired after every year, but every couple of years they would rehire him. He was Israeli, so he didn't mind being shouted at, and he didn't, he could deal with fighting with everybody. And in the off years, he ran a bagel bakery. So it was good news, bad news. When he was not our rabbi, we had better bagels. When he was our rabbi, we had a better rabbi, but the bagel situation got significantly worse. So I grew up with a strong sense that I was Jewish, but with a very weak sense of what it meant to be Jewish. And this turned out to be a really good combination for me as a trans kid. So because it was clear to me that there was no place for somebody like me in the world. And I tortured myself trying to figure out what somebody like me was. I tried.
Sorry interrupting again, but the question, so when did you know that you were trans? I mean, how early in your life did that become apparent to you?
I don't remember a time not identifying as female, but the first time I remember realizing that I saw myself differently than other people saw me. So there wasn't a word, word transgender hadn't been invented yet, but just that sense that somehow people understood me differently than I understood myself. First time I remember experiencing that was my first day of preschool. I'd been stuck at home with my mother, so I was dying to play with other children. And I ran to play with with my peer group. And to me, that was the girls. I didn't think about it. I just ran to play with the girls. But the girls jumped up, screamed, and ran away. What is going on here? Thought, well, they got here first, and they must be in the middle of a game I don't understand. So again, I went over and tried to join them, and I kept doing this, and they were running around the room claiming that I was trying to kiss them. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Kissing, this is like something your parents do when they're putting you to bed. I was clueless. And it wasn't till after that I realized that I saw them as being us, right? These are my people, but they looked at me and they saw me as being other, as being something else. And that was when I started realizing it was a problem. I don't have clear memories. Young children, I think, often don't form very clear memories, but young children trying to figure out something as complicated as the difference between sex and gender and how people see you and how you understand yourself. Remember, the term gender hadn't even been invented yet. So even adults were at the very beginning of figuring this out. All I know is that by the time I went to first grade, I was consciously what people would call now being in the closet. I was consciously hiding who I was. I felt that I was pretending to be a boy. I felt that at every moment I was in danger, that people would discover that I wasn't really who I was. Later, when I saw films about Jewish children who were raised in hiding in German homes and were pretending not to be Jewish, I felt this real sense of relationship. Not that I was living in Nazi Germany, but I felt, and I was right about this. I think if my parents had realized that I identified as something other than the boy that they knew me as, I think they probably would have institutionalized me, and trans kids were being experimented on and subjected to electric shock there. Anyway, it was an ugly thing. Even today, where there's more understanding, there's a disproportionate number of trans and non-binary kids who live on the streets because their parents beat them up, or they kick them out, or they make their lives so miserable that living on the street seems preferable to them. So I felt like I wouldn't be loved or welcomed as part of my family if my parents knew who I really was. I suspect I was right about that. And in the culture at large, it felt the same to me. I didn't know exactly what I was, but I was pretty sure that if other people knew who I was, they would see me as monstrous. I would be seen as unlovable and unwelcome and be expelled from everything, the little tiny world that kids grow up in. I didn't think that I would have a place anywhere in it. But the thing that scared me the most was that I felt that I would not be lovable. And this was complicated. I thought about this a lot. It's not a healthy thing for kids to grow up thinking about. But I felt like to be loved, I had to pass as a boy. But because the kid who was loved was a boy that I knew that I wasn't, I didn't really feel that I was loved. When people looked at me, I didn't feel like they were looking at me because I knew they weren't seeing me. I was being as careful as I could not to be seen as who I was, to pass as a boy. And so this was completely crazy making, right? To be loved, I had to not be myself. But if I wasn't myself, then I wasn't really loved. And that was this extremely debilitating way of growing up. And I think that being Jewish was a lifesaver in that regard, because being Jewish gave me a sense that there was a way that I could be different openly, that I didn't have to hide, a way that I could be different from most people but that would connect me to my family instead of separating me from my family, that would connect me to some kids and to my synagogue and to my Hebrew school. As what we would now call a trans person, I didn't feel like I had a past. There were no people who came before me. I didn't feel like I had a future. There were no role models. There were no expectations. It was just a blank. I was something, I often didn't feel like I was human. I was something else. But as a Jewish kid, as a Jewish boy, I grew up with a rich thousands of years of past. And it was my job, I knew, to make sure that there was a Jewish future, to do my bit, to keep that going, which meant that as a trans person, my life had no value in terms of my culture. Nobody wanted me to be who I was. Nobody could imagine who I was. And I was pretty sure that everybody would hate me if they knew who I was. But as a Jewish boy, I was valued. I had a place in the world, and my life was important. And this is where my family not having a clear, not being part of a very established idea of Judaism was really useful for me also. So I had this sense of being Jewish and a way of being openly different that connected me to people, but nobody told me really much about what that difference meant. We didn't live in a Jewish area, so there wasn't like a Jewish culture that I was part of. The synagogue was insane, right? The people who, I was very religious. I had a strong sense of God, and I loved going to services as a kid, which will give you an idea of how lonely I was. But I loved going to services with this small group of elderly men who didn't speak English. I thought that was really fun. And they were delighted to have somebody who was younger than 70 there. And they were eager to pass on Judaism to me. And so they talked to me a lot. And I couldn't understand what they said. I just smiled and nodded and tried not to eat the gefilte fish and other horrible things that they would try to get me to eat. And so I didn't absorb any traditional idea of what Judaism was supposed to be. I got to make it up myself. And the Judaism that I created was based, number one, on this sense of God as a living presence. This is not a very common idea in American Jewish communities, even religious. Like the modern Orthodox students that I have now, they mostly don't grow up with this idea. When Judaism and Christianity were working hard to differentiate themselves from one another, um, a rabbi, as a scholar, told me I couldn't quote him as saying this, but he said Jews and Christians made a bargain, and the bargain was Christians would get the personal relationship with God, part of the shared religious heritage, and Jews would get the reading and interpreting text part of the shared religious heritage. So Judaism developed this very elaborate way of engaging with texts and laws and thinking and Torah and thinking about that, but a fairly attenuated sense of God as somebody you have an individual relationship with. And in a lot of Christian communities, it's the opposite. It's an overgeneralization, but it was certainly true in my area. So, but kids who are isolated for any reason, and this is true of a lot of trans kids I've heard about, often grow up with a strong sense of the divine. Partly, I think, because what I would call God is, God doesn't have a body. God doesn't have what you would call a personality. God is pretty boring in human terms. God is sort of like vodka. No flavor, no color, no smell, no sight. So when you have the option of hanging out with other people or other kids and feeling like part of it, usually that's more exciting than hanging out with God. But when you feel completely isolated from human beings, suddenly that sense of a divine presence becomes a good alternative. You're a lot less distracted. And I consciously felt like God, this presence that I called God, was the only person who actually knew who I was. The only time that I said I to somebody and felt like the other person knew who I was referring to was when I was talking to God. So my Judaism was built on this personal presence of God and my reading of the Torah. And when I read the Torah, again, I didn't have teachers who were interpreting it. The Hebrew school we had focused on bar mitzvah preparation and Jewish history. They didn't talk about theology. So when I read the Torah, I'm like, oh, this is all about somebody like me. Somebody who doesn't have a body, so to make them visible, somebody who doesn't fit into human categories, somebody who really loves people, but who people don't know how to love. And so who is always feeling neglected and forgotten and angered. And I kind of envied God. You know, for a lot of people, there's the Hebrew Bible presents the theological problem of God getting angry and, you know, slaughtering large numbers of Israelites and other people. But when I read that stuff, I was like, go God, right? As, you know, for me, as somebody who was disembodied and invisible, when I felt neglected and unseen, all I could do with my anger was turn it inward. It wasn't safe for me to turn it outward. So I turned it into suicidality. God has a very, well, it's not healthy for human beings, but psychologically, you know, God doesn't hold the anger in the Torah. When God gets angry, God throws a tantrum. And God's anger is other people's problem. My anger was my problem. So I invented a Judaism that was what I needed as a trans kid. It was a Judaism that was made for one. And I had a Jewish identity which connected me to other Jews, but it wasn't rooted in a family or community idea of what Judaism was. And so I didn't have anybody to say, look, kid, you're wrong. God doesn't talk to kids this way, and certainly wouldn't talk to a queer kid this way. And that's what a lot of LGBTQ kids who grow up with that sense of God in religious households, they are soon schooled to feel like whoever they're talking to doesn't love them and doesn't want them. But nobody told me that. So I never had to choose between my sense of who I was and my religious experience and identification as a Jew. But I did feel like I had to keep that secret, right? So I had this outward Jewish identification that connected me to people, and I had this inward gender thing that I felt cut me off from every other human being. And the two of them together got me through a very difficult childhood. And I'm seeing some questions coming in. I thought maybe this would be a good place to pause. Ari, what are you noticing?
Sure. So one question was, did you have any siblings?
I have a sister, a younger sister, to whom I was very mean. So one thing that I will say is that despite not identifying as a male, I think I did an excellent impression of a mean older brother.
Do you have a good relationship? I don't know if she's still alive, but do you have a good relationship with her now?
She is still alive, but my family I was not the only thing that was problematic about my family. And she felt, at the age of 20, she felt like trying to engage with me was too painful for her to be worth it. And we only communicate around taking care of my mother at this point.
Jan wants to know, were your parents aware of your sense of aloneness and pain and issues you were going through? And if so, when were they aware and how did they react to this?
They were not. I don't totally understand my family, and it's not for lack of therapy sessions. I think I've put several therapists' children through advanced educational programs. But there are mysterious things about my family that that I'll never understand. But one of them is that they really didn't see how I tried to kill myself a couple of times when I was a kid, and they didn't notice. I remember for a year, I decided that I wouldn't smile, and they didn't notice. When I was in college, I met, as a freshman, I met a woman that I later married after college, and we divorced due to the gender transition many years later. But when I took her to home for the first time, it was traumatic for her. But my mother made her look at the family photo album, which is standard, and she burst out. She said, "Jay looks so miserable." That was my male name, Jay. And they stared at her like, "What are you talking about?" And it's true. I hadn't even noticed it either. But there are no pictures in which I was smiling. I looked miserable in every picture, and nobody in my family saw it. But they didn't even see it afterward. Many years later, my mother, after I came out, I tried to talk to my mother about what I had gone through, and she didn't want to hear it. She read my memoir where I talk about the suicide attempts and the misery and the isolation and stuff, and her only response was um, that I was unfair to her and my father because I implied that they wouldn't have given me money if I'd asked for it when we were poor after college. And I'm like, that's the one paragraph that jumped out at you? So there are some pretty powerful forces of denial that were holding my family together, and I participated in them also. Obviously, I felt like it was my job to conceal problematic aspects of myself. And I also denied what I was doing to my sister. Clearly, for her to not want to talk to me after all of these years, I was hurting her deeply in ways that I was shielding myself from recognizing or taking responsibility for.
There was a question about your bar mitzvah. Do you remember that? What was that experience like? And then the next question is your coming out and how that happened and when that happened.
Thank you. So the answer about my bar mitzvah is yes and no, in terms of remembering it. Preparing for my bar mitzvah was very important for me because remember, I was deeply religious, weirdly religious, idiosyncratically religious, but I was a deeply religious person. And I bar mitzvah kids had to sit with the rabbi of the, not the rabbi of the day, but the rabbi of the year we had to meet with privately. And he assigned me to read a book called To Be a Jew, which I did. I read it religiously. I read it all the way through. When I met with him, he said, "What did you learn from it?" And I said, "Wow, I learned that if this is what it means to be a Jew, I'm never going to be a good Jew." And he was furious with me and he didn't want to meet with me again. But the book did have an impact because I felt like, okay, I should start keeping kosher and doing some additional things. I was very drawn to taboos, partly because of being dissociated from my body as a trans person. Like I felt like my body wasn't mine. I really was drawn to the parts of Judaism that involved um, fasting and inflicting discomfort on yourself and stuff. And taking on kashrut had the additional advantage. Not only did it decrease the number of things I could eat, but it had the additional advantage of inconveniencing my family, which I saw as definitely a plus. So I read my Haftorah portion. I thought deeply about it. I was disappointed that they didn't want me to give a very long Devar Torah. I think I would have happily talked for hours, and they were like, "No, no, no, don't do that." And then when the day came, I have almost no memory of it. I was so full of adrenaline that I remember like the morning, and I remember afterward everybody who was invited to the reception brought Jello mold my mother was furious. And so I remember seeing a lot of people in a sea of Jell-O mold and people handing me envelopes with checks in them. But I don't really remember very much in between.
So given our limited time, if we fast forward now, we have to get to how you landed up at Yeshiva University, how you chose your field that you teach in. But I think we have to have a little bit more of the story to go from your childhood to university to your interest in teaching, and then why you and what's going on there today.
So I also grew up identifying as a poet. I won't get into it, but I was always writing poetry. And I chose a college based on poetry program, Sarah Lawrence College. And that's where I met the woman that I was referring to, who I married after college. And I worked in an office for years, writing poetry and waiting to become famous for it. And spoiler alert, that didn't happen. So I went to an MFA program at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, which is how I ended up in Western Massachusetts. Again, with the goal of becoming famous as a poet. And again, spoiler alert, that didn't happen. But I did learn that I loved teaching. So a mentor of mine suggested I get a PhD at Princeton, which would enable me to get a teaching job. And I did. I went to Princeton. I worked on American poetry. I went on the job market. And there was only one time that I was offered a tenure track position, and that was Yeshiva University. They're a deeply dysfunctional school. Maybe this is true of all schools, but I think they have their own je ne sais quoi. And they had put together this crazy job description, which happened to perfectly fit my experience. And so I got an interview. It was the only interview I got. I'd been on the market. I was having a miserable time. And they called me back for a campus visit, where I had a great time. And then they offered me the position. I remember it was before Shabbat. The dean called me. I was vacuuming. Afterward, one of my colleagues said, we hired you because the department needed more testosterone. So when I was hired, I had this sense of they did not know that I was transgender. They would not have hired me. If, Yeshiva University does not consider it a plus to have an openly transgender employee, and they wouldn't have hired me. But, I was living my life in the closet on the assumption that if anybody knew who I really was, they wouldn't want me. And that's certainly true of Yeshiva University. I love teaching there. I teach at the Women's College, and I didn't expect this, but being at the Women's College gave me a taste of this women's community. Remember from the time of my preschool, I had this, most people are homosocial, by which I mean we tend to socialize with people we see as being of the same gender that we are. That's homosociality. And but I was never able to get, to socialize with groups of girls or women. And I still wasn't as a teacher there, but at least I was in a world where there were all of these women who were socializing with each other, and I loved it. And I love them. And they're one of the advantages of being somebody who's seen as a male in a patriarchal, misogynist culture is that male teachers tend to do very well at Stern College. They're very popular and get great evaluations. And I was a very difficult teacher. I gave terrible grades, but I still was, I was dedicated. And I was very popular. And then I started falling apart, and we don't have time to talk about it, but really I was falling apart physically and psychologically. And I got to a point where I realized I couldn't keep living as a man. And I thought that meant I was going to kill myself. And I was preparing to do that. And I took out an insurance policy, but it had a 2-year waiting clause for suicide. And I was so disappointed I was like, I thought, oh my God, it's like being stuck in an elevator for 2 years with somebody you don't like, me and my male identity. And so I was just sticking it out. Um, but as I was living in that period, I was also, obviously, I didn't only want to die. There was this other aspect of me that really had always wanted to live, had always wanted to exist. And people rarely tell you that you should kill yourself, I've discovered. And nobody told me that I should kill myself. They all thought it was better to consider gender transition and that it would be better for my kids. And they were certainly right about that. So um, I was hanging on until I could get tenure. I worked like a demon. And I got early tenure. And at that point, my then wife knew that I was going to be transitioning, and our marriage had really fallen apart as a result. But when I got tenure, I sent a letter coming out to my dean, and I was put
Sorry,
on
what
what
year was that?
that was 2007, spring 2007. And she was very, very nice. But she told me, and I didn't think she was wrong, that somebody like me would never be accepted by students or their parents. And I was there like 15 months. I was back at the university teaching 15 months later. Neither of us could have imagined that that would happen. But I do have children. I have 3 children. Um, I saw that one. Um, the thing is that most places, you know those bumper stickers that say teach tolerance? Tolerance is not that great. Tolerance is better than not tolerating people who are different. But tolerating people who are different, that's what Yeshiva University has done. It was a huge step forward for them. But when you tolerate somebody who's different, you don't want to engage with their difference. You mostly want to say, look, you're here, we're done. We don't want to talk about this. We don't want to think about this. We want to ignore these aspects of you and move on. And that's a pretty uncomfortable and lonely position for the tolerated person to be in. So that has more or less been the way that it has been for me since I've come out.
When you came out at Yeshiva University, what was did you have many students before? Did that change the number of students? Did the way people treated you different? Was there, how did that affect your interaction with students? How many students took your class and where you are today with students?
Yeah, the semester that my last semester teaching as a man, I was a finalist for Teacher of the Year. And when I went back to teaching, I struggled to fill classes. And it's not surprising. I later found out that there were rabbis who told students not to work with me. Nobody treated me badly, to my face. People treated me respectfully, but many people just avoided me. One student who later took a lot of classes with me said that she had to ask her mother's permission, and that for the first 2 weeks she couldn't hear what I was saying. She could hear me talking, but she was so freaked out by me that she couldn't process the words. And that's not an uncommon reaction. When people are different in ways we don't understand, it creates this level of cognitive dissonance that can really be overwhelming for us. Yeshiva University, because it's committed to not implying that it's okay to be transgender, doesn't do anything to help students understand what this means. They don't support students who are LGBTQ. They are trying to sort of maintain this bubble of denial, even though they let me be there. And so, yeah, that has made me a pretty unpopular teacher after many years of being the opposite. It's kind of heartbreaking because I love the kids.
People are asking, what subjects did you teach at the school at Yeshiva University?
I teach different kinds of writing and American literature. I just want to say that if people are interested in the parts of my life that I've been talking about, there are a lot of details in my memoir, Through the Door of Life. I'm not trying to sell books here, but if you are interested, that book was really written to detail these experiences because I know that's it's an unusual perspective, and even a lot of trans memoirs don't look at things in this kind of detail.
Have you had any students come to you privately to talk to you about their own challenges in this regard?
Yes, I have. I had one student come out to me as trans. They came from an ultra-Orthodox family. And so born female in an ultra-Orthodox suburb of Los Angeles, so no cell phones. This community was so segregated that even though this student, when I met them, had a crew cut that was part purple and part green, their family didn't guess that they might be queer. All they heard was, you know, you really should wear your hair differently if you want to get a husband. So they've now transitioned to male brilliant student, but couldn't stay at the school. I had another student come out to me, and because it's still not okay to use the words lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender at the school, the student came out to me in my office all alone, but didn't tell me what she was coming out as. It was only afterward that I found out that she identifies as bisexual. She just said, I know you'll understand. I can't pretend to be other than I am anymore. And I have a friend who also can't be other than she really is. And I'm like, yes, yes. And then after she left, it's like, okay, I'm not sure if you really came out to me or not. Like if somebody comes out to you and you don't know what they came out as, did they really come out? It's a metaphysical conundrum. But so this is one of the reasons that it's important that we use these kinds of terms, that we talk about this stuff, because when we don't talk about the ways people are different, it starts to feel like it's unspeakable, like it's shameful. And our children grow up. It's not that we have children who don't grow up being different in these ways. This is just normal for human beings. But our kids have no idea what to make of themselves. They grow up like me. They feel like they're the only one of their kinds, that they have to hide and pretend, that they're not really loved, that they can't trust us, that we would hate them if we really knew who they were. Even my own youngest child came out to me as trans a couple of years ago, and I've been, out as trans for a while. He said he hadn't come out for a couple of years because he didn't really trust how I would react. It's a scary thing when a child has to tell their parent who they are, particularly when they're young.
Phyllis asks a good question, which is, has your relationship to Judaism changed since you came out and transitioned?
Yes and no. So it should have changed more than it did. So remember, I created this Judaism Built for One, and that had a lot of advantages, but one of the disadvantages is that I never had a sense of being connected to any actual Jewish community. I had a sense that I was Jewish and that connected me to people in general, but not to any actual Jewish community. And to be connected to a community, of course, you can't have an idiosyncratic religion. You got to share what other people are doing. That's kind of what a community is. It's what communal worship is. And I've never, I think partly because of the way I grew up as a kid, it's hard for me not to feel marginalized, to assume that that's true, and partly because I've never wanted to give up the advantages of my special form of Judaism. I've never really fully integrated, but the big difference is that when I was living as a man, I felt like God owed things to me. Like on Yom Kippur, I knew that I'd always been sort of scummy in one way or another, but I always felt like, yeah, but God, you've done worse to me than I've done worse to you. But once I started living as myself, the shoe has been completely on the other foot. And I feel like, wow, I've been blessed with this incredible miracle of being myself. And now I have to be grateful and worthy of it and stop kvetching.
Phyllis asked a question that I'll ask in maybe a different way. Are you still writing poetry, or do you write prose? And if so, how has your life experience affected what you write?
Mm. I write a lot of poetry. That's something I've never, when I don't write poetry, I start feeling very cranky. Um, and actually, my second book, which came out, was my last book that was published while I was still living as a man, but it was written in the persona of a fictional woman, has just been reissued. It's called The Book of Anna. And um, when I was writing poetry as a man, I felt like I couldn't write poems that were very honest, actually. You know, poetry is supposed to be, I feel that my idea of poetry is that it should be honest. It should be more than honest, it should be true. But it's very hard writing poetry that's true without being honest about yourself. I found it extremely difficult. And once I started living as myself, I stopped having to censor everything out. Poems just poured out of me in different, a lot of, that's most of the books that I've published. I've now published 9 books of poetry, and I'm trying to finish up a 10th. And that is a vastly greater output than when I was struggling to write poems that were true but not honest, because that's like the sound of one hand clapping.
So you don't have to answer questions. You can always take a pass if I ask you something you don't want to answer.
Sure, yeah.
People ask about your children, how, kind of how old they are and what your relationship is to them now, and how they, how they addressed your coming out.
I have 3 children. I have a son who is almost 26, and a daughter who's 21, and my youngest is 17, but is always telling me that he will soon be 18. He started saying that as soon as he turned 17. He feels that it's his job to prepare me for the shock. He feels like I am a very slow parent who is always behind where he is developmentally. So he's like, remember, I'm going to college, I'm going to be driving, I'm going to be voting, get used to it. So they were very young when I transitioned, and for them, I think most kids are pretty traumatized by divorces. There are some kids where they grow up in households where parents are fighting all the time and where divorce is sort of a relief. But my ex and I, we were very good co-parents. It wasn't like that. And so for my kids, the fact that we stopped living together anymore, that was awful and traumatic. And I'm pretty sure that it wasn't the only bad thing about my transition, but it was definitely the worst part. My ex felt really angry and abandoned, and the kids had to choose sides, and it was just awful. It's kind of legendarily awful in our small town, Western Massachusetts area. Yes, we're among the great bad divorces. But there was also difficulty in having a parent, again, in a small area, who is different in these ways. And my kids taught me a lot about that. They continued to call me daddy for a long time. My youngest, at a certain point, switched schools. I was very involved after my transition when he was young at the first school, and then switched schools, and he didn't want me to be there anymore. I said, why not? And he said, because number one, they'll look at you and they'll think I'm a kid with 2 moms, but that's not true. There's nothing wrong with having 2 moms, but that's not the kind of family that I have. And number 2, they'll be more interested in you than in me, and I want them to be interested in me. And I thought those were both profoundly good reasons. That one of the things about identity is they don't just belong to us alone, right? for my kids, their history includes, coming from a heterosexual family with a father and a mother. And for them, it's like erasing their past if people see me and say, "Oh, lesbian family, I'll write whatever." That's just not their true history. And the other is that their lives are all about them. They're not all about me for them. So they really challenged me to grow as a parent and a person by pushing back in those kinds of ways, although it was difficult for me.
I know we're almost out of time. Just a last few questions. A lot of good questions. A lot of people referring to other people as well, like Abby Chava Stein and her journey. So I'm sure there's other people. Other people have written books out there. I don't know if you can recommend people you've met with that have gone through transgender experiences and have written about it within the Jewish world, and that they're sharing with us. Anybody that you have met with or read that you recommend?
Well, there's a lot more resources now. One of the first books about this is called Balancing on the Mechitza, and it's an anthology. So it introduces you to these are now old writings, but those are a lot of the great uh, um, people who are working at the intersection of being Jewish and having identities that were more complicated than male or female. One of the things that Abby and I have in common um, are that we both fit into this kind of old-fashioned male to female transsexual mold of trans identity, but a lot of trans people identify in other ways. That's the most publicized version. It's the one that's most readily understood. Um, but there are particularly younger people are often identifying in more complicated ways and with different kinds of terms. And I do recommend Keshet, keshetonline.org, as an organization that has a lot of resources, including links to writings of LGBTQ Jews of all kinds, and has amazing events specifically for Jewish teens who identify as LGBTQ in different kinds of ways. So if you're interested, or if you know somebody who's looking for resources or is feeling isolated, they're a fantastic connection. And I'm happy to help people who are wondering. I don't think that the book world sees itself as having a huge market for trans Jewish stories. So I think there's more things online, a lot more blogging and informal kinds of publications than books you can put on the shelves.
Jewishly, are your kids, I mean, are you involved in Jewish communal life now, like a synagogue? And have you, and where are your children in the Jewish world? We started this program an hour ago, you talking about how you were intensely Jewish in your own way and very committed and had a relationship with God. Have you given that to your children, and where are you now in that relationship with God and the community?
Well, my children's Jewish involvement is somewhere other than where I am. They have not felt comfortable to be in uh, places where I am. And I think that some of that is common to young adults. I remember feeling like it was excruciating to be anywhere that my parents were known for quite a number of years. And some of it has to do with the bad divorce kind of stuff. I tried when I was living with them to share with them this intense sense of Jewishness and Judaism, but I don't know where they are now. I know that my daughter is a Jewish studies major, um, and which is fantastic. And she just um, published a piece about work that she's doing on reproductive rights as a Jewish issue. And I was very proud of the sophistication in terms of both feminism and Jewish identity that she was showing in that. I'm not really connected to any synagogue now, although I do a lot of stuff at different synagogues, and I'm connected with Jewish people. My wife, though, is very involved with a New York synagogue group called Minyan Ma'at, and they're lovely people. Maybe after the pandemic, when synagogues meet in person again, this will become more of an issue, but right now, being the kind of Jew I am somehow seems weirdly appropriate. Everybody's a disembodied Jew at the moment.
Last question I have is, I don't know if you've been to an Orthodox synagogue now as a woman, and if so, how did that feel going to a different section? My daughters, who are very feminist, and I dragged them to synagogues around the world. I took my 18-year-old to Eastern Europe. She was 17, and of course, the synagogue you go to is Orthodox. So I went downstairs, and she went upstairs, and she was just telling me how how she looks down on the men, and we have a club, and people are hugging and dancing and talking, and the women are upstairs really not doing much, and how she feels not included. But you now you would have had both experiences if you have been to an Orthodox synagogue as a woman. So I don't know if you have anything to add on that, and then we'll end.
Yes, that is a great question. And I'm sorry that I talk at such great length. These are fantastic questions, and I would love to stay longer with you. I'm remarried to the wife that I just mentioned. In terms of that last question, as you might imagine, not a lot of invitations to Orthodox synagogues, but my college does these Shabbatons on campus, and they invited me as a faculty member after my transition, and I was really weirded out by this. But I mean, this is the thing about tolerance. It's a form of denial. I'm like, really? Really? You just want me to go to the women's? Like, but yes, that's right. So I went to the women's section. I felt alienated and bored. I felt like, my students are better than the men who are leading the services below, sort of this parochial pride in them. And it was a complicated set of feelings because going to being separated in that kind of way was reinforcing to me in terms of my gender identification, my female gender identification. And it was also a sort of erasure because I was only there because they were erasing the way that I'm complicated. So my identity, the way that I feel, is female, whatever that means. But my life is the life of a transgender person. And it's one of the paradoxes that when I'm accepted as female, the way I was there, that comes at the cost of the erasure of the gender complicated fullness of my life. And knowing that gender complicated fullness means not really just accepting me as female in the way that I grew up longing for. I do consider myself a feminist. There's a complicated history of trans feminism. But I'm basically down with the idea that women are human beings, and I strongly think that every social structure and institution and assumption that is based on any idea other than that women are full human beings and should be fully valued is messed up and needs to change. So that's my feminism.
Jeff had a question that I was going to ask as well, which is, did you watch the series Transparent? And if so, what were your thoughts on it?
I was actually a sort of consultant for it. I had one phone conversation with the writer and the woman who created the series. It was a great conversation, and as near as I can tell, they ignored everything that I said. They were very deep questions about Judaism and gender, and the show was, I think, not deep about Judaism or gender. I thought that it was very enjoyable. It didn't really resemble any Jewish life that I was familiar with. Maybe it was, I mean, it's very Southern California, so it's sunny all the time. Everybody is so wealthy that they don't even think about the fabulous houses they're living in. And it looks like every time you walk out the door, you have to work hard not to have sex with somebody. So that idea of Jewish life was so foreign to me. It seemed nice, but it just wasn't a way of life that I was familiar with. I loved that Jill Soloway created the series, wanted to do it partly for her father, who was transitioning and had a very tortured relation to trans identity. And I thought that that was very beautiful. I thought that the trans parent in the series was a terrible parent because there was no space that was created for the children to talk about or even have their feelings about the transition or what it meant for them. And in a weird way, it was like everybody was just supposed to act like, yep, this is just normal, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Don't, you know, in a way, it was very much like Yeshiva University. But there it was because we're supposed to be so advanced that we're over this, and nothing needs to be said. But I think if you're a parent and there's a big life change in your family, isn't it part of your job as a parent to create spaces and opportunities for your kids to feel about it and respond to it and react to it and be with them in it?
There was an early question that I think is worth asking because it is complicated for us. But if you're a trans person, how does that affect your sexuality? So can you be trans and be gay? Can you be trans but attracted to it is a little confusing. Can you shed light on that? Because I think it's a fair question that was asked early in this program.
So I want to go back to that moment of my birth, that it's a boy moment. At that point, of course, there were gay people. There've always been gay people, but there wasn't an awareness that being heterosexual wasn't sort of bundled up with being identified as male or female, right? They weren't seen as separate things. If you were normal, you were heterosexual. If you were not heterosexual, something had gone wrong with your maleness or femaleness, right? But it turns out that these really are independent variables in ways of being human. And it's the same with trans people. There's nothing about, just as there's nothing about being physically male or female that says whether you're going to be heterosexual or bisexual or gay, there is nothing about being trans that determines what your choice of sex partner would be. In my experience, different trans people feel differently about this, but I don't feel like the terms heterosexual and gay work very well for somebody like me. And lesbian in particular is not just about physical attraction. There's also a whole culture and history that goes with the idea of lesbian. It's not something that I share directly. So I identify myself as a lesbian. My wife's name is Liz. I'm in love with Liz. That's the person I want to be with. I don't need to know any more about my sexuality than that.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I know for some in the program, they've been dealing with it either personally or they have family members. I have friends who have kids in their family now that are coming out like at bar mitzvah age, which is very scary and confusing for my friends it's their nieces or nephews, just because they don't understand. And but I guess what I tell my friend is it's amazing that these kids now can do it at that age, and that the society has set it up in certain states, I would say, certain parts of the country. But it is confusing for us. So thank you for sharing and for sharing your journey with us and your writing and about your poetry. I will share your books with everybody in a follow-up. I will share a recording of this program. Right now it's unlisted. If I can make it open, I can make it open to everybody in general. It's up to you if that's okay.
Sure, absolutely, yeah.
I think it's important for more people to learn more. And we go into Pesach, a holiday of freedom. So I'm wishing you a holiday of more freedom. And it's certainly a hard time as well, given coronavirus and people not being able to get together, everybody. But I'm hoping that you have a great Pesach in a way that's meaningful to you. And as well, I wish the same thing for our CSP online community. And we wish you well at YU. You are you're a trailblazer in what you're doing. And I guess my hope, and I assume many people's hope here, is that the students value you for being a teacher, and that and that obviously they can learn from you, and hopefully we can learn from you as well here at CSP. I know you have a lot to teach. That's not about your background, but about your teaching. So let's bring you back and have you as a teacher.
Thank you. love that. And thank you, everybody. And have a Chag Sameach. And Ari, I noticed several people asking how they can see the replay of the program.
Yeah, so I'm recording it. This is our 200 and what is it, 15th program. Many of them are up on our YouTube channel. So anybody that's signed up in the program will get a link shared with them directly. So we'll have that. And then as well as some resources based on this program, your books and some of the stuff that you mentioned, I think will be in there. I try to share the link. So Karen seems very happy, excited to get all the follow-up emails. Anyway, thank you, everybody. Look forward to seeing you next few days. And if not, have a Chag Sameach, a happy and healthy Pesach. Thank you, Joy. Thank you for being with us and sharing your stories.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.